In this lesson, we're going to be using Photoshop to recomposite and touch up our final rendered images. So picking up where we left off from our previous lesson, we now have the depth pass, occlusion pass, and color pass of our squid rendered out. So now I'm going to take these, and in this case I'm just going to use Photoshop to now composite these back together, although you can really use any application you want for this process. So let's start by taking our color pass, and let's begin by just replacing this background with something a little bit different. You can see right now how we do have this pale blue background, although I want to start to give this scene a little bit more of a kind of a spotlight type of feel. So let me start by just simply double-clicking on this layer, so that way that'll switch this to layer 0 rather than a lockdown background layer. And you can see that we do have an alpha channel that's been rendered into this. So what I'm going to do is just control-click on this alpha channel, and that will go ahead and highlight all the areas in white. And so now all I have to do is press Control-Shift-I to invert the selection, and now just press backspace to clear that selection out. Okay, and basically that will now give us this transparent background to work with. So now let's come in, we'll make a new layer, and we'll drop this underneath, and on this layer we'll put something like a simple gradient. So we'll switch to our gradient tool, we'll switch this to a radial gradient. Now in this case I want to make sure that the white color of the swatch is on top, so that way whenever I click and drag to create this gradient, it starts from the center out. It starts to create this white background from the center out. So let's try to just kind of draw this out, and I'm just trying a few different strokes here until I find something that is a little bit more suitable, so that way we kind of get this white area that kind of spreads out nice and far. Okay, now one thing you might notice, and this is kind of a subtle thing, is that on this squid you can still see a little bit of the halo from this blue background that we had on here before. So in order to remove that, what we can do in Photoshop is just select that layer and go to Layer, Matting, and Defringe. And what that'll do is basically contract everything by a width of 1 pixel or however much we choose. You can see how that does a really nice job of just kind of choking that back and removing any kind of a halo that we may have had. Okay, so now we have a background on here, but now we need to give it some kind of a color. Ideally, probably something that's a little bit more on the blue side, so we can have something that matches up with this reflection, which is the whole reason that we had this reflection here in the first place. So now let's go back to this layer 1, which is our gradient background. I might just double click on this and rename this accordingly. Now I'm going to come in and add a new adjustment layer, in this case a hue and saturation. Now what I want to do is enable colorize. So that way, once this is turned on, we can now come in and start to actually fill this and adjust the hue of this colored background. We can also start to increase the lightness for this if we want this to be darker or lighter. So I'll start to bump up this lightness a little bit more. There we go. And you can see now how that just creates a little bit more interesting background behind this character. Alright, so now let's begin actually bringing in some of our other passes. So we have our occlusion pass back here, which will really kind of help to add some really kind of soft grounding shadows on this. So to bring this over, I'll just press Control-A to select everything, Control-C to copy it, and now on this squid color pass, we'll press Control-V to paste it in. Okay, now with most occlusion passes, a lot of times you'll find people just simply taking this occlusion pass and just setting it to a simple multiply overlay mode. So that way it just really makes all the white areas transparent. The problem with that, though, is that I find that the shadows that you get as a result of this are very unnatural looking. You can see how it just kind of creates this really, really dark shadowed effects. So as opposed to using just a simple multiply method, I like to use something a little bit different. So to illustrate this, I'm going to set this back to a normal blend mode. And now I'm going to go over to the Channels tab. This is the same place that we went to access the alpha channel, but you'll notice that now because this occlusion pass is on the topmost layer, how this now shows up in the red, green, and blue channels. So what I'm going to do is simply control-click on any of these channels, whether it be red, green, or blue, and you can see how it'll go in and select all the black areas, or rather it'll select all the white areas of our image. So with this in place, I'm just going to make this layer invisible. I'll make a new layer on top of it. I'll make sure that I have my fill mode set to black. And now with this selection, I actually want to invert this. So just like we had to do with our alpha channel, I'm going to press Control-Shift-I to invert, or you can just simply go to Select and then invert the selection from here. And now, with my background layer, or my foreground layer set to black, we'll just simply fill that in. And then press Control-D to deselect. Now, at this point, it really doesn't look any different than what we would have gotten if we just simply set this to a multiply mode. But in this case, you can see now that we have some transparency. It's actually clear and transparent behind here because we've just taken our selection, filled it with black. So now, what this gives us the ability to do is use a slightly different blend mode. And in this case, what I actually like to use is a soft light. And you can see how this starts to now give us something that's much more natural looking. You can see that now the occlusion, as opposed to just being this simple black and white, which is what we would have had before, you can see now with this soft light, the occlusion starts to take on much more of the color of the background objects. So the tongue has a little bit darker red occlusion to it. These areas of the eyes, since they're very bright, really don't start to have a whole lot of occlusion in these areas unless they're kind of one of these darker shaded areas. And then same with the ground. So this is the method I really like to use for compositing occlusion. Just take this, and you can basically, if you're using something like After Effects, use this as a mask or some kind of a track matte in order to trim out some kind of a black layer. Use that and then set that to a soft light. Alright, now I want to take this squid. Right now it's a little bit on the dark side. And I'll probably take this and just give this a little bit lighter color. So I'm going to add a new adjustment layer so we can start to adjust the levels on this squid color pass. So let's come in and let's drop in something like a levels. And just kind of brighten this up a little bit more. Something fairly subtle. There we go. So you can kind of see what the difference that makes. Now, instead of this particular levels adjustment layer that we just applied affecting everything below it, what I can do is just simply press Alt and then click on this dividing line between these two layers. And once I click on that, you can see now that this levels has been locked to this layer 0. So now it only affects this squid layer and nothing underneath it, which in this case is really what we want. Okay, so at this point now we have the occlusion that's been set up on this and set to a nice soft light blend mode. And we now have the background layer that is kind of this nice soft gradient appearance that really kind of matches up nicely with this reflected blue environment that we had set up several lessons previous. So what we'll start to do in the next lesson is begin adding some depth of field effects and just some final photo retouching effects to really finish off this image.